This presentation is divided into two parts, a more general one on cultural studies approaches to cultural analysis, and a more specific empirical one on Latin American cultural networks and their implications for cultural analysis. Obviously, there's a connection. From the perspective of a set of cultural studies perspectives, we can say that work that cultures do is heterogeneous. There's all kinds, as the speaker before me said, cultural studies does all kinds of stuff and maybe doesn't have a center or a particular theory. It may, however, cultural studies approaches may involve how cultural forms and discourses constitute subjects, how cultural practices work to restrict or open up public space, how they shape memory, either generating or diverting it, how cultural interventions help maintain a status quo or to transform it, how cultural labor generates economic and other forms of capital, for example, in urban revitalization, how cultural works critique and or produce pleasure, and so on. We can also study or recognize cultural forms and practices as instruments of government, as we heard Tony Bennett speak in the opening lecture, and resistance and opposition, and how they form part of the work of institutions, which was also part of Tony Bennett's talk. And that's what I'm referring to. The theoretical approaches that underpin, this is so I don't have to say all that. The theoretical approaches that underpin the analysis and understanding of the work done by cultural work, by culture, may posit the autonomy of the work or practice, social integration, conflict, distinction, creative immaterial labor, which is both subsumed in the information society, but can also operate as a resource for revolutionary transformations, according to people like Negri and Lazzarato. As will become evident in the second, more empirical part of this presentation, the networks with which I collaborate range from the more conventional community-based organizations that seek to empower local residents to the more activist networks that seek to transform the wider social formation. While they all work with cultural and artistic forms like film, video, theater, and music, their scope is broader than the artistic or community culture. Moreover, as they circulate texts and organize face-to-face encounters through the mediation of digital technologies, the internet and social media, the resulting action is much more than communication, produced, consumed, and circulated. These are also expressions of solidarity and organizational acts. So the emphasis here will be on act rather than just text. Given their interactive and translocal territorial reach, many of them range across many countries, conventional cultural studies methods of analysis may not grasp fully the significance of these networks' activities. A question arises: what is the proper or best way to study and understand the work of these networks? Approaches that focus on the autonomy of the art object, or on the resistance or political economy, or an ideological capture, or on governmentality, are partial and hence sometimes misleading in their partiality. Even deploying all of these approaches in some integral way may miss important innovations in the practices of these networks. I didn't say novelties. Shedding some light on these innovations is the purpose of this presentation. We can begin with the well-known, and what I want to do is a critique of the well-known, circuit of culture to assess whether or not it can account for the significance of these practices. As you know, this is one of the foundational elements of cultural studies, going back to the Birmingham Center. The achievement of these two approaches is that they go beyond a reflectionist understanding of a cultural object or practice, although the emphasis of the analysis continues to be the object or the text, and especially those of mainstream commercial establishment. They're basically interested in media culture. Both Johnson and Duguay and Stuart Hall and colleagues. The significance of cultural forms is constructed by recourse to what Paul Duguay et al. Call shared frameworks or maps of meaning, and Johnson calls lived cultures and social relations. These, in turn, are structured by modes of production and consumption that are particular to given situations. Both studies, or both proposals, Johnson's and Duguay's, downgrade the prominence that production held in Marxist aesthetics. Johnson writes that inferring the text as read from the text as produced ignores the elements of production in other moments of the circuit and ends up concentrating creativity in the producer or the critic. Duguay, in turn, focusing on the productive possibilities offered by consumer technologies like the Walkman, the text I'm referring is to the Walkman book, states, quote, "The role of the producer and the so-called consumer of culture are becoming much more interchangeable. Consumption is becoming more of a personal act of production in its own right." A pretty commonplace observation, end of quote, a pretty commonplace observation by 1997 when the book came out, especially since Alvin Toffler coined the phrase prosumer in 1980. So it's something that had already in industry and in future studies by people like Toffler being looked at for quite a while. Ultimately, both Duguay and Johnson focus on the relation of cultural forms to subjectivity. Johnson writes, "The text is no longer studied for its own sake, nor even for the social effects it may be thought to produce, but rather for the subjective or cultural forms which it realizes and makes available. The text is only a means in cultural study. Strictly, perhaps, it is a raw material from which certain forms, for example, a narrative, ideological, problematic, mode of address, subject position, etc., may be abstracted. It may also form part of a larger discursive field or combination of forms occurring in other social spaces with some regularity. But the ultimate object of cultural studies is not, in any view, the text, but the social life of subjective forms at each moment of their circulation, including their textual embodiments," end of quote. Duguay, in turn, focuses on the signifying practices and social technologies that constitute identity and lifestyle, in the particular case of the Walkman, youth culture. For the sake of time, I skip a section in which I critique the way in which Johnson assumes that cultural forms internalize subjectivity. There is a problem that in cultural studies there's an assumption that reading texts, that there's demonstration effects in film, in text, so on and so forth, and people are structured internally, subjectively, by the reading of those texts. That's a widespread assumption in a lot of kinds of cultural analysis. It leaves aside subjective work that goes into circulation, and in another section in which I elaborate on the way in which users and consumers also become intermediaries, not just producers. It's not the question of the prosumer. We all know that, well, at least for ages now, we've looked at quote-unquote resistant viewers who can redo the text in the way that they receive it. But there's other things that happen especially in the new technologies, which is that readers, viewers, users are no longer just prosumers, they're also become intermediaries, right? Intermediaries that do things, that just don't read, but they also do things. And this is something that, again, I have to leave this aside or I'll never get to my empirical information, that people like Negri and Lazzarato are examining in terms of immaterial labor and its usefulness within what they call cognitive capitalism, what Castells called informational society, so on and so forth. The claim that, is that slide number 7? Yeah. Lazzarato, Negri, Virno, etc. The claim that new media encourage the relative delegitimation of professional intermediaries. This is pretty much true. It's very obvious in the music industry. And the rise of grassroots and vernacular intermediaries, and the proposal to treat this transformation as a requirement of capital itself, that is, for Negri, Lazzarato, and so on and so forth, this is not a subversive resistant activity, but it's already part of what the new capital forms require in a cognitive capitalism, leads to rethinking a major sociological theory of culture, Bourdieu, and the notion of the field. For Bourdieu, fields are autonomous domains of activity, like music or literature, wherein each agent is defined by his or her position. Each autonomous field has its set of rules that give it coherence, although competing actors, quote, struggle over the definition of the legitimate principles of the division of the field, close quote. They do so in accordance with their habitus, that is, quote, the matrix of dispositions that serves to effectively organize perceptions, resulting in, quote, an ontological complicity between the world and our faculties of making sense of it. Fields are also characterized by a growing interdependence of organizations that in the aggregate constitute a recognized area of institutional life. Key suppliers, resource and product consumers, regulatory agencies, and other organizations that produce similar services and products. This is the case in textuality as well, where you have regulatory agencies that have to do with pornography and so on and so forth. The field is then another way of accounting for the disciplinary institutions that instill a habitus, which operates in a manner similar to the Heideggerian dictum that language speaks man. So in the field, you could say that the field speaks man through the habitus. Bourdieu writes, quote, as a habit-forming force, the school provides those who have undergone its direct or indirect influence, not so much with particular and particularized schemes of thought, as with that general disposition which engenders particular schemes, which may then be applied in different domains of thought and action, a disposition that one could call the cultivated habitus. But even the most conservative of the cultural institutions, the institution of art, includes what Bourdieu defines as arbitrary, as in the case of relational art that may take the form of a dinner at a collector's home. Bourriot is the reference to relational art there. And of course, the line between art and advertising was blurred by artists like Warhol. I mean, where Bourdieu, admittedly this is from 1990, but still by 1990, Warhol had already been doing advertising-based art that, according to this, should not have been either within the legitimate or the legitimizable sphere, right? What we see in the current conjuncture is the breakdown of discipline and the emergence of other forms of regulation, although biennials and museums and the artists they exhibit continue to capitalize on the blurring of the fields. I mean, the blurring of the fields is actually like a gold mine. It's something that enables artists to continue to, quote unquote, innovate in the interstices of the fields. Even if that blurring within art institutions is much less important in the society at large. The breakdown of discipline is not due to the force of new technologies, the ones that I referred to earlier, but also to the obsolescence of institutions like mass schooling, or at least the function of mass schooling as the function that it had under industrial society is no longer the one that we have now. So there's rethinking of that, emergence of private education and all series of transformations. So those are having implications on discipline itself. So on the obsolescence of certain institutions like mass schooling and the concomitant transformation of cultural fields, the most evident one in my case that I study, the music industry, which has been radically changed since the 90s. With that, accompanying regulatory mechanisms like copyright, which was part of, within the circuit of culture, the regulatory function. Consumers are not reined in. They continue to download content, and many artists and producers leave copyright aside. In other words, if discipline is something that instills, I mean, I get Kantian here, you know, to desire one's duty and to desire the law. Well, obviously, most of you don't desire to just respect copyright. and downloading is not a transgression for a lot of people. Hence, there's an aspect of discipline that has eroded. And that has had some effects on the music industry, not even the most important ones, but some effects. In order to understand this phenomenon, we should look not only to the places where the industry established itself as a field, with a set of interlocking institutions, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. This hegemonic model of the music industry was and continues to be weak in certain regions of the world, like Latin America, but also the Middle East and Asia regions, parts of these countries, of these regions. And the attempts to clone the model in these regions has not worked, precisely because the social and economic structures do not support it. This is even more evident in the attempt to transform Nollywood, just to take one example of a very successful audiovisual industry, the largest one in the world. 2,000 films a year versus 1,100 in India versus 600 in Hollywood. Hollywood has 85 to 90% of all box office in the world, despite the fact that it produces much less than either Bollywood or Hollywood. So it produces about 3 times as many films as Hollywood, and the important thing is that it doesn't work with copyright at all, right? So that's among its... So it produces about 3 times as many films as Hollywood and twice as many as Bollywood, and employs, albeit at very low incomes, 500,000 people. Yet this industry developed without investment, even from formal companies or venture capital firms, which is the mode of doing it in Hollywood, as is the case in Hollywood, without a huge corporate infrastructure and without recourse to copyright. As the industry prospered, government and financial initiatives sought to ratchet up that industry in the direction of Hollywood, including the establishment of copyright protection and anti-piracy measures in a social context in which they are unworkable and may only contribute to the criminalization of people who have been working in that industry very productively and without being illegal. Because when you produce a Nollywood disc, it costs anywhere between $1 and $2, which is exactly what the pirate copy of a Hollywood film costs. So you don't need to pirate Nollywood films. Of course, that's connected to a whole set of other things, has nothing to do with advertising, it doesn't need promotion, so on and so forth. So the huge costs in all cultural production, whether it's music or book or video or film, is actually the promotion. The amount of money it takes to promote any product so that you go out and buy it. Institutions in Latin American countries are generally weak, and this has been the case historically with cultural institutions which in the region were always already failed clones of European institutions, especially of the French Ministry of Culture, accounting in part for the lion's share of funding in Latin America going to Eurocentric cultural forms, opera, theater, the national theaters, the national operas, the philharmonics, so on and so forth, in countries where 95% of the people have very different cultural interests and preferences. Of course, this scenario has changed since the 1980s. That is, the French model is no longer the model. After Latin American countries went through their equivalent of the civil rights reform after the deposition of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, a reform that's still in process, although hampered by neoliberal policies implemented in the same 1980s. The drafting of new constitutions that were part of the democratization process, beginning with Brazil in 1988 and Colombia in 1991, and more recently in Bolivia's and Ecuador's new constitutions, acknowledged the multicultural character of those countries and concomitantly legislated measures for cultural policy to carry out the recognition of the populations of those countries. However, in the most important areas of cultural administration, music, film, and TV, this remit was largely in the hands of the global entertainment conglomerate. So no matter what government did, right, in terms of cultural policy, how do you stand up to Warner, Emmy, Sony, or nowadays Apple, Microsoft, so on and so forth? Governments, in fact, the GDP of some of the countries is much less than that of Apple or Microsoft, so on and so forth, of the smaller countries. And of course, with the relative exceptions of Mexico and Brazil that have huge TV and media industries, Televisa in Mexico and Globo in Brazil. Between 85 and 90% of the film box office continues to be controlled by Hollywood. And in music, many countries, especially the smaller ones, get almost no coverage of their own musicians on radio or TV. So this is something important to know. No matter what government does, right? When you turn on the radio in Costa Rica, only 95% of the music is by Costa Rican musicians. That doesn't mean all Costa Rican musicians, but that means that by any Costa Rican musician, you have 5%. And that's the same case in many of the smaller countries that are not Mexico or Brazil. Yet while it is no doubt that the case that global entertainment conglomerates have the lion's share of distribution on radio, TV, and in cineplexes in the film theaters, according to the mainstream measurement companies like Comscore, Nielsen, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, it is not the case that global content is what large numbers of Central Americans or Latin Americans listen to. They listen to local musics anyway. So the question is, and that's something that the industry organized with its measurement mechanisms doesn't register. For example, in that same Costa Rica, concerts are packed wherever local groups like Malpais performed. They have a huge following of people who know the lyrics to their songs and sing along at concerts. They achieve this without the same level of advertising and promotion that groups like Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden, to name two that just recently visited Costa Rica, without the level of advertisement of these mainstream global groups. As you know, the music industry has passed from making profits on phonograms to live music, but it has generally turned in the new conglomerates like Live Nation have actually pretty much gathered all the programmers in the world for large venues, so that the profits are still going to a few very large programming institutions. Before it used to be the record labels, now it's also the programmers. Moreover, the fact that this is a local group, Malpais, does not mean that its references are only local. Local and provincial are not synonymous. I will return to this and other examples of music and audiovisual production that operate in complex networks that cannot be understood only through the circuit of culture as proposed by Johnson and Duguay. One very obvious dimension of today's social media-assisted networks is the interaction among their actors, who do not only modify and repost already crafted media texts, as is often celebrated in remix culture, but also generate different kinds of content and share all kinds of information. And in the case of cultural networks on which I am reporting, organize offline encounters and initiatives. That is to say that what cultural networks do with their intermediaries is not just circulate already created content, but also to the degree that they're trying to build a cultural sector in their locality, they are also having offline meetings and organizing face-to-face. As the example that I'll speak about with which I happen to work. In other words, what is usually analyzed as texts caught in the coaction of representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation, the circuit, they're also acts, which are not necessarily best analyzed as representations that are then internalized to produce subjectivity, which they also are. All right? No one's saying that they're not also representations, but that's not the only significant aspect of sense-making. Significance, meaning, understanding is not only semiotic or semantic, it is also interactional and performative. I skip, for lack of time, a set of references that usership theories based on Wittgenstein's language games, Austin's performatives, and Butler's performativity reference to account for the significance of cultural work as action. There are, of course, antecedents in the non-virtual cultural sphere. That is, a lot of what goes on today of circulation and getting different things through the internet has been done forever, like graffiti. Graffiti was a way to circulate different messages, right? The music of the popular classes, street theater, these are all represented there, graffiti, muralism, samizdat, pirate and TV radio stations, etc. What John Downing, what the communicologist Downing has called communication nanomedia. There's the communication nanomedia of the past and the communication nanomedia of the new social networks. But all of these are reborn and re-energized, so to speak, on the internet, social media and wireless telephony. We have to take into consideration wireless. I should have mentioned AT&T, Alcatel, Telefonica, and other ones, because through convergence, as we know, the companies that are most going to control content and its circulations are the telecommunications companies, or the convergence of film, television, internet, and telephony. As such, they pose a greater challenge to the cultural field as Bourdieu had defined it. That is, the convergence that we see now poses a challenge to the nicely well-defined sets of rules within fields, right? Not only do different fields shade into each other, like in the companies themselves that bring together film, music, and a series of other narratives, so on and so forth. Some of them empty out as well. In my earlier discussion of Bourdieu, I touched on his argument that even if some individuals are opposed to the rules of legitimation, by default, according to him, they endorse the validity of the field by seeking to propose an alternative legitimation. However, there are many expressions that do not seek to enter into the sphere of legitimacy of the existing institutions, precisely because they construct their own publicity in the context of lack of interest in those fields by state and commercial enterprises. Where the state and commercial enterprises don't operate, often there's a whole set of other interests that don't necessarily always steer in the direction of those fields. And they develop their own informal business models and massive publics. We're not talking about small publics, niche publics, we're talking about huge publics in Latin American countries. This is the case of what an anthropologist called parallel culture industries, using parallel the way that parallel currency used to be called, right, in informal markets. So informal markets in the Latin American case are very huge markets. And they offer a site of productivity and circulation and different kinds of operations than do the formal ones where the fields have had their force. Of course, this is going to be difficult to see, but here's a classification of different kinds of, in this case, music. It could be done for different forms of culture and audiovisual and so on and so forth, but ranging from major labels to fine arts to art music to indies to anarcho-punk, popular culture, art and action, mixed models within the field, parallel music, which is the informal one I'll talk about, and new network forms of creating music business, especially among youth. This will be left if anyone wants to see this, because I imagine that you probably have a difficult time seeing the specificities of this classification. In any case, parallel musics occupy an interesting place in the ecology of culture industries. Unlike bohemian or politically motivated alternatives, you could say like punk, and unlike punk or community-based initiatives, parallel musics are vernacular and operate outside the framework of the state and mainstream commercial enterprises and in the informal sphere. like funk music in Rio's favelas. These are 5 different types of parallel musics or informal businesses of music, like funk in Rio, tecnobrega in Belém do Pará, champeta in Cartagena de Indias, cumbia villera in Buenos Aires, or techno huayno in Lima, so on. What makes them interesting, aside from their abandonment of mainstream norms, is their disinterest in copyright protection of income and their adoption of what the anthropologist Hermano Viana, who's also a TV and internet producer, has called música paralela. In his travels over 80,000 kilometers in 82 cities in Brazil as a music producer, to document the musical diversity of the country, Viana came across tecnobrega in the northern city of Belém do Pará, a techno form of brega music. I don't know if brega means the same thing in Portugal that it means in Brazil, but it means corny, cheesy, cheap, kitsch. And Roberto Carlos was an example, the romantic balladeer Roberto Carlos. In Spanish, it would be Julio Iglesias or Rafael, right? It's okay. So, in any case, Viana found that this is one city in Belém, that over 3,000 parties and 849 concerts were held each month, that the music had a thriving business without the participation of major recording studios and without using copyright to protect CDs. In fact, CD is not the major form of business. In fact, musicians use local pirates to distribute music, but sort of like business cards for presentation for people to go to concerts. But even more important than that is the fact that most of the money to be made from music is in the concerts and not in the sales of CDs. Recordings are part of a social commons to which people feel committed. There's an engagement with that form. That is, virtually no one believed in music as a form of property, all right? Which again goes back to speak about the whole question of institutional discipline, whether or not you're gonna, at least in some areas, I'm sure that if it's your house, you believe in property, but when it comes to circulating music, it's a different story. Okay, Viana was inspired by this model of music production, and here we begin to see a network that is innovating, to try to give a platform for the diversity of musics that he saw. By the way, he published a 4-volume box called Projeto Música Brasil. And it had, 10 songs per CD? That's 40 songs. He covered 8. So in order to try to find a way for people to get to know all this diversity of music, he created Overmundo, right? So that, and it's an internet portal platform that was born around the same time as YouTube, and unfortunately he didn't have, had YouTube already, had Facebook already existed, it would have been easy. But they got engineers, they had to raise the money to create a platform, the equivalent of YouTube and Facebook, with social media, which was very costly. And they were able, over time, to get a reasonably okay response in Brazil. They have people uploading content, music, literature, audiovisual, etc., onto the platform. They had, because it went defunct precisely because people migrated to Facebook, and they themselves migrated to Facebook because of the expense of actually having engineers maintaining, so on and so forth, a platform like this, right? So, in any case, you could see that it had a pretty reasonable response among users. From a juridical point of view, it's important to understand that these counterpublics that were involved in conversations as well over the music and the literature, so on and so forth, were experienced as outside the intellectual property regime. Instead of copyright, participants used Creative Commons licenses to protect their work from becoming the source of profits for businesses that had nothing to do with the people who were circulating the information, the content. As Ronaldo Lemos, Viana's associate in Overmundo and director of Creative Commons Brazil, observed, Música Paralela blurred the boundary between the legal and the illegal, and Overmundo followed its lead. I myself have been more directly involved with another complex networking initiative, Hecho in Centroamérica, Made in Central America, for the development of the music sector. It emerged precisely to deal with the lack of opportunities for local musicians in the region, the problem that I mentioned before. It brings together musicians, producers, entrepreneurs, managers, music labels, designers, visual artists, representatives, and institutions of Central American musics to map, make visible, and facilitate cultural work so that it may be visible to regional venues and institutions, and thus better disseminate that work. In this way, the initiative creates a music environment that the previous model of the majors left underdeveloped. I mean, the majors were never interested in developing Central American musicians. They were interested in selling international music, mostly American music, and so were the Mexicans, Mexican music to Central America. So where does that put Central American musicians? In the need of trying to find some way of creating a sector. It could be said that the music field, to use Bourdieu's term, is inoperative in this region. That is why Central Americans have to construct the sector almost wholesale. In seeking to increase visibility and livelihood, Central American musics cross into other fields. Again, the problem of the field. They cross into fields like tourism, to sell music to tourists, to get profits. And hence they get involved in that field. Art in action with youth at risk. That is, local small organizations that work with kids who get into gangs or drug use and use music to get kids out of those things. So they get involved in that. That's another field. Environmentalism is another one. And that this is what helps ensure the cultural rights and also the sustainability, both the sustainability of the initiative, but also to get at the kinds of cultural interests that the youth have. And questions of heritage, even if it's not heritage in the old European sense, it might be the heritage of rock, of cumbia, so on and so forth. The current networks continue and extend initiatives started in the mid-90s before the social media era started, and they ratchet up. They increased activity in 2007 with the first attempt to create a platform with the advice of the creators of Overmundo and technicians who oversee the Mexican National Council's Cultural Information System, who are technicians in networks, media networks. Subsequently augmented by social technology like Google Groups and by Facebook, where they spent a lot of money creating their own platform from 2007, and also ended up using Facebook because it's very expensive to create your own platform from scratch when you have the tools available for free, so long as Facebook can advertise on your homepage. Made in Central America worked with very local individuals and groups as well as large networks like the Association for the Development of the Music Industry in Ibero-America, which means it has also Spanish and Portuguese collaborators in that network as well as Latin Americans. Based in Medellin, all right, Colombia, and in the International Music Fair in Guadalajara in Mexico, thus establishing a set of circuits. One of the means by which they try to increase the work and exposure of musicians is to create networks from Colombia all the way to Mexico. That is, to create circuits where people could go on circuits, the kinds of circuits that Live Nation, that the programmers of concerts do not create for these musicians. They have to do that through collaborations and networks. Among recent developments have been the network of Central American labels, a music market that you see here, and other collective initiatives, both entrepreneurial and associative, that will catapult these musics, hopefully, both locally and throughout Latin America and other international locations. The goal is a more structured activity and increasingly sustainable and sustained music scene. Among the projects are innovative web-based distribution ones like Automata Records, which sells albums cheaply, entire albums, 10, 12 songs for $2 to avoid piracy. Additionally, you download a code. You get the code, you pay for it, and you download the music when you enter the code on the site, right? And they embed the code in t-shirts, in skateboards, and so what happens is that the way of doing music latches onto fashion and other forms of consumption. Not to romanticize this or any other network that I work with or that I conduct research on, it is important, as my wife Sylvie, one of the main organizers of Made in Central America, who's sitting back there, she reminds me every day not to romanticize these networks because of all the work she has to do to coordinate, to state that a lot of the work by intermediaries, some of whom are musicians or producers themselves, goes into creating the circumstance. It's hard work to create the circumstances under which the participants in these networks, who are often rivals, rival labels, rival producers, rival musicians, right, for venues and for artists, to work together as allies and not to seek to use the network for personal gain. The objective is to create a workable sector. So it takes that is, intermediaries who work here have a lot of work. So there's a lot of work in making culture happen, right? I leave aside reference to continental meetings of networks at which Made in Central America and other initiatives like the Peruvian collective Grupo Chasqui have established working relations. So what there are is Latin America-wide and Ibero-America-wide meetings of networks where they get together and try to hammer out initiatives that will be beneficial to the different parties. Again, with the understanding that there may be different people trying to control these networks for their own gain. Chasqui, the audiovisual network that I'll speak about now, was formed in 1982, influenced by the Third Worldist antecedents. As you may know, or maybe not know, that Latin America was very well known, particularly Cinema Novo, but other initiatives in Cuba and Peru for very Third Worldist, right? Taking on Italian neo-realism as one of the styles, and also what they call the cinema of hunger, an imperfect cinema, that is using, sort of like yesterday, using rudimentary techniques to say something about the audiovisual production and the contents thereof. They were influenced by this group, Ucamau, but more recently retrofitted itself in the 2000s to new technologies. Chasqui works with local people to give them a space where they can tell their stories and also plays a role in shaping consciousness. In contrast to Hollywood-style filmmaking and also to European-style auteur films, the collective rejects the traditional hierarchical structure of filmmaking in favor of a democratic, communitarian, collaborative practice. The process being understood as extending well beyond the immediate product. That is, the film itself is not even the major significance of the action of making film. As one of the early members, Osvaldo Carpio, states, because we make films from within, we have taken the name of the ancient communicators of the Incan Empire, the Chasquis, a system that worked and that put communication at the service of an entire people. So they see communication within the light of an old heritage of what communication meant within the Inca society. Chasqui promotes politically progressive filmmaking by fostering not only production, but also distribution and exhibition, and in the process creating a community of film-savvy collaborators and publics who also partake of making the films. So it's not just an audience that watches films, but also audiences who then become filmmakers, video makers, and circulators. In 2003, Grupo Chasqui stopped working with commercial distributors and set up a chain of micro-cinemas, now numbering 42, in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. They not only exhibit and discuss cinema in settings like those reviewed above, fostering a critical audiovisual literacy, that's one of the major issues, critical audiovisual literacy, but use the sites to engage the community in filmmaking projects. The micro cinemas are also micro and small enterprises. Again, sustainability is important here, like in Central America. Managed by the leaders of the community, capable of working as cultural promoters who seek autonomy and sustainability. The founders have made award-winning films. They themselves are filmmakers who have made award-winning films, like these here, which I will not describe for lack of time. And in 2010, they began to sponsor workshops for collective filmmaking projects analogous to those of other collectives. According to Stefan Kaspar, one of the founders of Grupo Chasqui, the new technology had already transformed even the poorest citizens. By the way, Peru has something like 120% cell phone use in Peru, despite the poverty of a large number of the population. And so cell phone technology is one of the major ways in which increasingly people will be accessing audiovisual. Even the poorer citizens into users of diversity of audiovisual technologies. Indeed, the popular classes use video on a daily basis, and the workshops are meant to help develop a vibrant audiovisual culture through the generation of a diversity of cinematic languages. The important point is that these videos circulate from one's microcinema to another, thus establishing a set of conversations that establish a different sense of cinephilia and transcend the conventional way of viewing film. You don't just view film like in a movie theater, you view it in dialogue with other viewers. The aesthetics of film and video are not simply in the narrative or the montage, that is, in the content and form of an audiovisual work. A film or video is an act in itself, a ritual, a form of establishing solidarity. Circulation linked to indigenous video production conveys this other aspect, which is largely missing from mainstream discussions of audiovisual media, as well as many alternative accounts. Anthropologist Jeff Himpeley provides a way of understanding how circulation itself can evoke and even participate in the production of indigenous worlds. The significance is not necessarily in the semiotic material internal, the semiotic structure internal to the product, to the work, but in the way it's used and circulates. What is of value, last sentence, in this regime, then, is the expansion of indigenous worlds via the circulation of their media. Circulation of video has brought indigenous groups into contact with each other, as explained by Vincent Carelli, or Carelli, he's actually Portuguese, Brazilian. Slide 30, founder of Vídeo nas Aldeias, Video in the Villages, an indigenous audiovisual project that began in 1987 in connection with the Centro de Trabalho Indigenista, Center of Indigenous Labor, founded in 1979 to seek alternatives to the Brazilian government's ideology of assimilation at the time. At first, the indigenous communities sought to register their culture for future generations and to explore it in the present, as in the case in which they recuperated a nose-piercing ritual that had been abandoned years before, but that they found in sort of like cousin tribe that exchanged videos with each other and decided to recuperate the nose-piercing ritual. Video for them is a social practice. Vídeo nas Aldeias adapted the documentary filmmaking methodology of the Atelier Varin workshops in Paris to the collective practice of indigenous communities. Video makers do not work with scripts. They begin by focusing on a character's daily life in the village and go on to assemble the video in a collective setting. With the digital revolution, editing, which is also done through a process of collective feedback, became significantly easier, as did the subsequent diffusion of the work on YouTube, Vimeo, and a number of other internet platforms. I'm concluding here, I'm getting close. While the indigenous videos of Vídeo nas Aldeias focus on daily life and rituals, those who produce them do not see them primarily as ethnographies or documentaries. Rather, as already indicated, they see them as a ritual or a practice. This is evident in the video letters. So videos can also be letters, which actually, the experience of migrants, if you remember the old cassettes, a migrant community in Turkey or in Germany might send back to people in Turkey a cassette, the old cassettes. Well, the indigenous peoples do the same thing with video in Brazil. Video letters, they send to non-indigenous communities seeking to establish exchanges. An example of this is from the Ipkeng Children to the World, which has one, I'm not going to show it to you, I have another one that I'll show 2 minutes. has won no fewer than 7 awards, and where an indigenous response is provided to a video letter sent from the Sierra Maestra community in Cuba to the Amazon. In the video, 4 Ipkeng children speak directly to the viewer, not only showing what their life is like, but also engaging in numerous antics and ironic performances that seem sometimes like stand-up comedy. So the video clip here, another relevant video, I'll describe it first, and you'll see a little piece, which is part of the Troca de Olhares, Exchange of Gazes series, is Mojinho, Little Favela. In this documentary, the video, it's a documentary video, this one. The indigenous filmmakers, Zezinho Yube, their youth, and Bebito Pianco chronicle their encounter with the young creators of a scale model favela in Rio de Janeiro. So they go from the Amazon in Acre, several thousand kilometers, to Rio de Janeiro to engage, to film what's in the favela and take it back to their community in Acre. The film begins with Zezinho and Bebito, who are thousands of kilometers away, flying over the spectacular cityscape of Rio de Janeiro, as Zezinho's voice off-screen says, a lot of people think that indigenous filmmakers only film their culture, but we're also curious about other realities. This and other films are shown in Mojinho in a cineclub setting like the ones I said before that establish a different kind of cinephilia, reminiscent of the thousands of such venues in Brazil and Latin America. So let's just see, I actually have to go to the video. Okay, I could only show you a little bit because there's a lack of time here and we have to move on. And to conclude, filmmaker and scholar activist Cesar Millorin coined the term post-industrial for audiovisual production and circulation that eschews the professionalism of commercial film and video and focuses on a range of peripheral audiovisual experiences involving favela youth, indigenous groups, informal production modes, and young people who are disaffected by commercial venues and university training, of which there's a lot. People who actually go into communications degrees and drop out after 2 or 3 years and join these collectives. He notes something that I have witnessed in my travels throughout Latin America. People see a lot of film and video in alternative venues and not just on TV, and much less in movie houses. Many of these post-industrial films circulate through festivals, screenings, DVDs, cineclubs, informal stands, and the web. One is hard put to find them in movie houses or malls. This is part of the reality of the economy of cultural abundance, is what it's called. Cultural abundance of production. The problem, of course, is always circulation, for which you need to find new avenues. I have given here and elaborated on in recent writings and have found ways to, about the way in which people invent new avenues, new venues, and means of circulating people and works. The many ways of maintaining circulation are thus not just a technological or mechanical issue, but a matter of crucial cultural and political practices. I have collaborated with and written on many other networks, just quickly. This is Cesar Millorin's essay, such as Cultura Viva Comunitaria, a network of networks in which hundreds of initiatives throughout Latin America collaborate, but I don't have the time to go into this. Their passion for art and culture is not limited to production. 38? No. I got my slides out of whack here. Is not limited, their passion for art and culture is not limited to production, circulation, and reception, but extends to the creation of new entrepreneurial models and interventions into policy at times to facilitate their work. Moreover, they all seek to change the post-industrial politics cum market complex, and they have come to realize that establishing transnational relations and markets forms part of crucial strategies for seeking sustainability in the current stage of global capital. They do not find these strategies to be in conflict with local needs. On the contrary, they strengthen the reach of the local. Those of us who circulate in cultural studies venues tend to focus on the semiotic analysis of texts. And so, again, the point. But there is enormous significance and meaning in networking, inventing new forms of circulation in business, new ways of coordinating collaboration among participants. Thank you.